The engagement party was in full swing when I walked through the doors of St. Michael's Community Center in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in ivory linen, and the sound of clinking glasses mixed with polite laughter filled the air. I had driven 12 hours straight from Fort Campbell, still wearing my dress uniform because I hadn't had time to change. The bronze star with Valor gleamed on my chest, along with the combat medical badge I had earned pulling wounded soldiers from a burning Humvee in Afghanistan just 6 months earlier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But none of that mattered to the woman who spotted me first. "Oh, wonderful," my sister Jessica's voice carried across the room like a blade. "Sarah's here to make everything about herself again." She stood near the gift table in a flowing champagne dress, her engagement ring catching the light as she gestured dismissively in my direction. Her fiancé, Captain Michael Thompson, stood beside her in his dress blues, looking uncomfortable as heads began to turn. My parents, Robert and Linda Martinez, quickly moved toward us, their faces already wearing that familiar expression of barely contained embarrassment. "Sarah, honey," my mother whispered, her voice tight with forced cheerfulness. "Maybe you could have changed first? This is Jessica's special night." I felt the weight of every eye in the room, the whispered conversations beginning to ripple outward. Family friends, distant relatives, Jessica's college sorority sisters, all of them watching the family drama unfold, the same old pattern playing out once again. Sarah the disappointment. Sarah the one who never quite fit in. Sarah who always found a way to embarrass the family. What they didn't know was that I had been awake for 36 hours straight. What they couldn't see was the letter folded in my pocket from a Gold Star mother thanking me for bringing her son home alive. What they refused to understand was that I had chosen duty over their expectations, service over their comfort, and honor over their approval. I stood there in that moment, surrounded by people who shared my blood but had never truly seen me, and realized that this was exactly where the story needed to begin. Because sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on foreign soil. Sometimes they're fought in community centers in small Iowa towns, where the wounds cut deeper than any enemy fire ever could. My name is Sarah Elena Martinez, and for as long as I can remember, I have been the wrong daughter in the right family. Not wrong in the way that broken things are wrong, but wrong in the way that puzzle pieces are wrong when they belong to an entirely different picture. Growing up on Maple Street in Cedar Falls, I lived in a house where perfection had a name, and that name was Jessica. 3 years younger than me, she moved through our childhood like sunlight through windows, effortless and warm, touching everything with a golden glow that made our parents smile in ways I had never quite managed to inspire. Our house was a modest 2-story colonial with blue shutters and a front porch where my mother grew roses every spring. Inside, the walls were covered with photographs, a timeline of family moments frozen in glossy frames. But if you looked closely, really looked, you'd notice something. Jessica's face appeared in nearly every image, radiant and centered, while I seemed to hover at the edges, slightly out of focus, as if the camera itself couldn't quite decide whether I belonged in the frame. The pattern started early. When Jessica took her first steps, my parents called the entire extended family to witness the miracle. When I had learned to walk months earlier, it was noted with a simple checkmark on my baby book. When Jessica spoke her first word, Mama, it was recorded on video and played at every family gathering for years. When I had said Papa first, it was forgotten by the following Tuesday. School brought no relief from this dynamic. Jessica excelled effortlessly, bringing home report cards filled with A's and glowing teacher comments about her sweet disposition and natural leadership abilities. She was student body president, homecoming queen, captain of the debate team. Her college applications were works of art, filled with volunteer work, academic achievements, and recommendation letters that read like love poems. I was different. My grades were solid but not spectacular. I preferred the weight room to the debate podium, cross-country running to student government meetings. I volunteered at the local veterans' home on weekends, listening to old soldiers tell stories about wars my classmates had only read about in history books. My guidance counselor once told my parents I was competent but unremarkable, a phrase that would echo in my mind for years. The dinner table was where the difference between us crystallized most clearly. Every evening at 6 o'clock sharp, We gathered around the oak table my grandfather had built with his own hands decades earlier. My father would ask about our days, and Jessica would launch into animated stories about her latest academic triumph or social victory. Her words painted vivid pictures of a life lived in full color, each accomplishment another brushstroke in the masterpiece that was her existence. When the spotlight inevitably turned to me, I struggled to find words that matched her eloquence. My days were quieter, more internal. I read books about military history, practiced first aid techniques I'd learned in health class, spent hours running through Riverside Memorial Park thinking about places beyond the borders of our small town. But these interests seemed to create a language barrier between me and my family, as if I were speaking in code they couldn't decipher. "Sarah's going through a phase," my mother would explain to relatives who asked about my lack of participation in traditional teenage activities. "She'll grow out of it and find her path, just like Jessica did." But I wasn't going through a phase. I was searching for something they couldn't see, something that existed beyond the carefully constructed expectations of middle-class respectability. I was looking for a way to matter, to contribute something meaningful to the world, to prove that quiet strength could be just as valuable as charismatic charm. The military called to me long before I fully understood why. It started with stories from my grandfather Antonio, my father's father, who had served in Vietnam and rarely spoke about it except in fragments and whispers. He would sit on the back porch during family barbecues, nursing a beer and staring at something beyond the horizon that only he could see. Sometimes, when Jessica was busy being the center of attention inside, I would sit beside him in comfortable silence. "You got steel in you, Mija," he told me once, his weathered hand resting briefly on my shoulder. "Different kind than your sister, but steel all the same. Don't let anybody tell you it ain't valuable." Those words planted a seed that grew slowly but persistently through my high school years. While Jessica dated the quarterback and planned her future sorority life, I researched military occupational specialties and read memoirs written by female veterans. While she shopped for prom dresses, I practiced combat first aid techniques and studied for the ASVAB. The day I told my family I planned to enlist in the Army after graduation, the silence around the dinner table was so complete I could hear the ice maker cycling in the kitchen refrigerator. My father set down his fork with deliberate precision. My mother's hand went to her throat, and Jessica actually laughed. "You're joking, right?" Jessica said, her voice carrying that particular tone of disbelief she reserved for my more unusual announcements. "Sarah, you can't be serious. The Army? What about college? What about your future?" My father cleared his throat, the way he did when he was about to deliver what he considered wisdom. "Sweetheart, the military is for people who don't have other options. You're smart enough for college. You could study nursing, become a teacher, like your mother wanted to be. There are respectable careers that don't require you to go off and play soldier." The phrase "play soldier" hit me like a physical blow. In that moment, I understood that they saw my calling not as noble service, but as an elaborate game, a rebellion against their vision of who I should become. The gap between their world and mine suddenly felt as wide as an ocean. My mother tried a gentler approach, reaching across the table to cover my hand with hers. "Honey, we just want what's best for you. Jessica's got her marketing internship lined up, and she's already looking at engagement rings with Michael. You could have that too. A nice local boy, a stable career, grandchildren for us to spoil. Why complicate things with all this military nonsense?" That word, nonsense, crystallized everything I had been feeling but couldn't articulate. To them, my desire to serve was nonsense. My grandfather's sacrifice was nonsense. The veterans I visited every weekend, with their Purple Hearts and their stories of brotherhood forged in combat, were engaging in nonsense. I excused myself from the table that night and walked to Riverside Memorial Park, where granite monuments honored the town's war dead. Standing among those silent sentinels, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my life forever. I would join the Army not to spite my family, but to honor something larger than their expectations. I would serve because my grandfather's steel ran through my veins, and I finally understood what he meant when he said I was valuable. The months leading up to my departure were marked by a cold war of disapproval. My parents went through the motions of support, telling neighbors about my phase, and expressing confidence that I would come to my senses once I experienced real life in the military. Jessica alternated between mockery and attempts at sisterly intervention, bringing home college brochures and job applications as if she could cure me of my delusion through persistent exposure to more acceptable alternatives. I weathered their campaign with the same quiet determination that had carried me through 18 years of being the wrong daughter. I worked out religiously, studied military history, and corresponded with a recruiter who treated my questions with the respect and seriousness my family couldn't muster. For the first time in my life, someone saw my interests as strengths rather than character flaws. The night before I left for basic training, Jessica knocked on my bedroom door. She stood in the doorway wearing her homecoming queen tiara, ironically. A gesture that would have been funny if it hadn't felt so calculated. "You know this is just going to make everything harder, right?" she said, settling onto my bed like she owned it. "Mom and Dad are already dealing with enough stress. They don't need to worry about you getting yourself killed in some desert somewhere." I continued packing my duffel bag, folding clothes with the precision I'd been practicing for weeks. "I'm not doing this to hurt anyone, Jess. I'm doing it because it's who I am." She studied me with the analytical gaze she usually reserved for marketing problems at her internship. "No, Sarah, this is who you think you are because you've never tried to be anything else. You've spent so much time being different that you don't know how to be normal."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Normal. There was that word again, the standard by which every choice was measured in our family. Normal meant staying close to home, marrying young, producing grandchildren on schedule, and never venturing too far beyond the comfortable boundaries of small-town expectations. Normal meant being Jessica. "Maybe I don't want to be normal," I said quietly, zipping the bag closed. "Maybe normal isn't enough for me." She stood up, smoothing her skirt with hands that had never known calluses or split knuckles. "Well, don't come crying to us when you realize you've thrown away every opportunity you had for a real life. Some of us actually care about this family's reputation." After she left, I sat alone in my childhood bedroom for the last time, surrounded by the evidence of 18 years spent trying to fit into a space that was never designed for me. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of becoming someone new, someone forged by discipline and purpose, rather than shaped by familial expectations. I pulled out a piece of paper and wrote a letter to my grandfather, even though he had been gone for 2 years. I told him about the steel he had recognized in me, how it was finally going to be tested and tempered in ways he would understand. I told him about the decision I had made and the path I was choosing, despite the cost it might exact from the only family I had ever known. Then I sealed the letter in an envelope and tucked it into my grandfather's old toolbox, the one my father had given me as a goodbye gift. It was the first genuine gesture of support I had received, and I treasured it not just for what it represented, but for what it connected me to. 3 generations of Martinez strength, passed down through bloodlines and stories, through sacrifice and service, through the quiet understanding that some things are worth more than comfort or approval. As I drifted off to sleep that final night, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice carried on the Iowa wind. "Steel, mija. Don't let anybody tell you it ain't valuable." The bus to Fort Benning left at dawn, and I was ready. Basic training at Fort Benning was everything I had hoped it would be, and nothing my family could have understood. The Georgia heat pressed down like a living thing, thick and relentless, turning every physical challenge into a test of will as much as endurance. But for the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who measured worth not by social grace or family connections, but by effort, commitment, and the ability to push through when everything inside you wanted to quit. The transformation began immediately. Drill Sergeant Washington, a compact woman with eyes that could strip paint and a voice that carried the authority of absolute conviction, looked at our ragged formation of recruits and saw not the failures or successes we had been in civilian life, but raw material to be forged into something stronger. "You think you know who you are," she announced on our first morning, pacing in front of us with mechanical precision. "You think the life you lived before this moment defines what you're capable of. You're wrong. Today, you start becoming who you were meant to be." Her words hit me with the force of revelation. For 18 years, I had been defined by what I wasn't. I wasn't Jessica, wasn't the golden child, wasn't the daughter who made my parents beam with pride at community gatherings. But here, stripped of the context that had shaped my identity, I could build something new from the foundation up. The physical demands were brutal but clarifying. Every morning began before dawn, with runs that pushed my lungs to burning, obstacle courses that tested limits I didn't know I possessed, and training exercises that demanded precision under pressure. My body, which had been strong from years of cross-country running, adapted and hardened. My mind, freed from the constant background noise of familial disappointment, sharpened its focus on the immediate challenges at hand. But it was the medical training that truly captured my soul. When I volunteered for the 68W Military Occupational Specialty, Combat Medic, my fellow recruits questioned the choice. Combat medics carried extra weight, bore additional responsibility, and faced dangers that went beyond personal survival to encompass the lives of others. But sitting in those first anatomy classes, learning to read the human body like a map, understanding how to repair what was broken, and preserve what was precious, I felt the pieces of my purpose clicking into place. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, our primary medical instructor, was a veteran of 3 deployments who carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen the worst humanity could inflict and still believed in the possibility of healing. During our first practical exercise, he watched me work through a simulated trauma scenario with methodical precision, my hands steady despite the manufactured chaos around me. "Martinez," he said afterward, pulling me aside while the other trainees cleaned equipment, "you've got something here. Natural instincts, steady hands, and most importantly, you don't panic when things go sideways. That's not something you can teach." His recognition meant more to me than any academic award Jessica had ever received, because it was based on something real and immediate. In the civilian world, I had been judged against arbitrary standards of social acceptability. Here, competence was measured by the ability to save lives under the worst possible conditions. The skills I was learning would determine whether someone's son or daughter came home alive, whether a parent would receive a folded flag or a reunion embrace. The weeks passed in a blur of increasingly complex challenges. We learned to navigate in complete darkness, to communicate under enemy fire, to make critical medical decisions with incomplete information and unlimited consequences. I excelled not because the training was easy, but because it demanded the same qualities I had been developing in isolation for years. Quiet determination, the ability to function independently, and the willingness to carry responsibility that others might find overwhelming. My fellow trainees began to notice. During field exercises, they sought me out when medical situations arose. When someone twisted an ankle during a night march, they called for Martinez. When a training accident left a recruit with a deep laceration, they trusted Martinez to keep calm and provide proper care until professional medical help arrived. Gradually, I realized that I was becoming exactly what Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had seen in me from the beginning, someone others could depend on when everything else fell apart. But the real test came during our final field training exercise, a week-long simulation designed to replicate the chaos and unpredictability of actual combat conditions. We were divided into squads and given a series of mission objectives that required us to work together under extreme stress while maintaining our individual specialties. As the squad's designated medic, I carried not only my own equipment, but additional medical supplies that could mean the difference between life and death for my teammates. The scenario began simply enough. Our squad was tasked with reaching a specific grid coordinate, establishing a defensive position, and maintaining communication with command, while treating simulated casualties according to realistic triage protocols. But complications arose almost immediately. Simulated enemy contact separated our group, forcing us to adapt and overcome obstacles that pushed everyone to their breaking point. It was during the 3rd day of the exercise that everything changed. Private Johnson, a quiet kid from Montana who had become one of my closest friends during training, stepped wrong during a river crossing and went down hard. The injury was real, not simulated. His ankle twisted at an angle that made my stomach clench, and the sound he made when he tried to put weight on it told me everything I needed to know about the severity of the damage. The instructors watched from a distance as I moved into action. Training took over. Muscle memory and countless hours of practice guiding my hands as I assessed the injury, established proper stabilization, and began the process of preparing Johnson for evacuation. But we were miles from the nearest road, with no vehicle support and communication equipment that had been damaged during our earlier river crossing. "We need to get him out of here," I told our squad leader, Corporal Williams, while continuing to monitor Johnson's condition. "This isn't something he can walk off, and if we don't get proper medical attention soon, we're looking at permanent damage." Williams, a former college football player who had initially questioned my presence in the squad, looked at me with something approaching respect. "What do you need?" What followed was 6 hours of the most challenging medical care I had ever provided. Using materials from our field packs and improvised supplies from our surroundings, I constructed a stretcher system that would allow us to transport Johnson without exacerbating his injury. More importantly, I had to maintain his medical stability during a forced march through difficult terrain while coordinating with our remaining communication equipment to guide emergency personnel to our location. The evacuation itself became a testament to everything we had learned about teamwork and perseverance. Each member of our squad took turns carrying Johnson, following routes I plotted based on medical necessity rather than tactical convenience. I monitored his vital signs continuously, adjusting our pace and rest intervals to prevent shock while ensuring we maintained forward progress toward the extraction point. When the medical helicopter finally appeared on the horizon, Johnson was conscious, stable, and joking weakly about missing the rest of the exercise. As the flight medics took over his care, one of them pulled me aside. "You did good work out there," he said, reviewing the medical documentation I had maintained throughout the ordeal. "Clean assessment, proper stabilization, excellent record keeping under pressure. You sure you're just a trainee?" But it was the look in my squad members' eyes that really mattered. Williams shook my hand with a grip that conveyed respect earned through competence rather than granted through courtesy. The other soldiers, who had initially seen me as the quiet girl who kept to herself, now regarded me as someone they could trust with their lives. The final weeks of basic training passed quickly after that incident. I graduated in the top 10% of my class, but more importantly, I had discovered something about myself that no family dinner table conversation could have revealed. Under pressure, when lives hung in the balance, I became the person others turned to for help. The skills I was learning weren't just about medical technique or tactical proficiency. They were about accepting responsibility for outcomes that extended far beyond my own welfare. Advanced individual training at Fort Sam Houston in Texas deepened this understanding. The 68W program pushed us beyond basic field medicine into complex trauma care, pharmacology, and the psychological challenges of treating combat casualties. We learned to intubate patients while under simulated enemy fire, to perform emergency surgery with improvised instruments, and to make triage decisions that would haunt civilian medical professionals for years. But we also learned about the other side of combat medicine, the victories that made all the sacrifices worthwhile. During one training scenario, I successfully stabilized a simulated casualty with multiple traumatic injuries, maintaining his vital signs through a complex evacuation process that took over 2 hours. When the exercise concluded, our instructor, a combat veteran named Sergeant First Class Thompson, approached me with something approaching reverence. "Martinez, in my 3 deployments, I've seen medics with years of experience struggle with scenarios less complex than what you just handled. You've got a gift for this work, and more importantly, you've got the temperament for it. Don't let anybody convince you that what you're doing isn't important." His words carried weight because they came from someone who had been there, who understood the difference between training and reality, who knew what it meant to hold someone's life in your hands while explosions shook the ground around you. But they also resonated because they represented a complete reversal of everything I had heard from my family about the value of my choices. During our rare phone calls home, I tried to share some of what I was experiencing with my parents and Jessica. I told them about the medical training, about the leadership responsibilities I was being given, about the sense of purpose that grew stronger with each passing week. But their responses revealed a fundamental disconnect that no amount of explanation could bridge. "That's nice, honey," my mother would say, her voice carrying the tone she used when humoring a child's elaborate fantasy. "But when are you coming home?" Jessica's engagement party is coming up, and it would mean so much to have the whole family together. My father's approach was more direct. Sarah, you've proven your point. You're tough, you're independent, we get it. But you can't build a real life around playing army. What happens when you get too old for all this physical stuff? What happens when you want to settle down and have a family? Jessica's perspective was perhaps the most painful, because it came wrapped in the language of sisterly concern. I just worry about you, she would say during our conversations. You're missing out on all the normal experiences people our age are supposed to have. Dating, career building, establishing yourself in a community. Instead, you're off playing soldier with a bunch of people who are probably just trying to escape their own problems. The phrase playing soldier had followed me from that first dinner table conversation to these long-distance calls, a dismissive reduction of everything I was working toward. But now it carried an additional sting because I knew exactly what real soldiering entailed. I had seen the commitment it required, the sacrifices it demanded, and the profound sense of purpose it provided. To have that reduced to child's play by people who had never tested themselves against any meaningful challenge felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than simple disagreement. The disconnect became even more pronounced when I received my first duty assignment, Fort Campbell, Kentucky, home of the 101st Airborne Division, where I would serve as a combat medic with a unit scheduled for deployment to Afghanistan within 18 months. The assignment represented everything I had been working toward, an opportunity to put my training to use in service of something larger than myself. When I called home with the news, the silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I wondered if the connection had been lost. Afghanistan? My mother finally whispered, and I could hear tears in her voice. Sarah, people die there. People get hurt. What if something happens to you? My father took the phone, his voice heavy with the kind of resigned disappointment I had heard throughout my childhood. This has gone too far. You've made your point, proved you're tough, but enough is enough. It's time to come home before you get yourself killed, for no good reason. But it was Jessica's reaction that revealed the true depth of our fundamental differences. When she took the phone, her voice carried a cold anger I had never heard before. You're being selfish, she said without preamble. You're putting us through hell because you have some fantasy about being a hero. Do you have any idea what this is doing to Mom and Dad? Do you care at all about how your choices affect the people who actually love you? The accusation that I didn't care about my family's feelings was particularly cruel because it ignored the very real pain I felt at their inability to understand or support my calling. I did care about their feelings, but I also understood that caring couldn't be allowed to override the deeper sense of purpose that had finally given my life meaning and direction. I do care, I said quietly, staring out the window of my barracks room at the other soldiers moving with purpose across the base grounds. But I also care about serving something bigger than my own comfort. I care about using the skills I've learned to help people who are risking everything to protect our freedom. I care about honoring the sacrifice of soldiers like Grandpa Antonio, who understood what it meant to serve. The mention of our grandfather clearly struck a nerve. Don't you dare bring Grandpa into this, Jessica snapped. He served because he had to, because there was a draft. He didn't have choices like you do. He didn't choose to abandon his family for some misguided sense of adventure. Her words revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of both our grandfather's experience and my own motivations. But they also revealed something else. A fear that my choices represented, a rejection of everything she valued, a repudiation of the path she had chosen and the life she was building. After we hung up, I sat alone in my room and thought about the growing distance between my family and me. It wasn't just geographical distance, though the miles certainly contributed to the sense of separation. It was the distance between different ways of understanding what constituted a meaningful life, different definitions of success and service, different visions of what it meant to honor the responsibilities that came with privilege and opportunity. I pulled out a piece of paper and began writing a letter to my grandfather's memory, something I had started doing during the most challenging moments of my training. In these letters, I tried to explain not just what I was doing, but why I was doing it, and how his example had shaped my understanding of what it meant to carry the Martinez name with honor. Grandpa, I wrote, I know you understood something about service that the rest of the family doesn't see. You knew that some things are worth more than personal comfort, that some responsibilities can't be measured by immediate rewards or family approval. I'm trying to live up to the steel you saw in me, even though the price keeps getting higher. As I wrote, I realized that my deployment to Afghanistan would represent more than just a military assignment. It would be the ultimate test of everything I had been working toward, the moment when training transformed into reality and theory became life and death decision-making. It would also represent a point of no return in my relationship with my family, a line crossed that might never be uncrossed. But I also understood that this was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The girl who had sat silently at family dinner tables, who had been dismissed as going through a phase, who had been told she was playing soldier, was about to discover what she was truly capable of when everything she had learned was put to the ultimate test. The steel my grandfather had recognized was about to be tempered in the fires of combat, and I was ready for whatever that process might reveal. The forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan existed in a landscape that seemed to belong to another planet. Jagged mountains rose like broken teeth against an endless sky, their slopes painted in shades of brown and gray that shifted with the light. The air tasted of dust and diesel fuel, punctuated by the constant hum of generators and the distant thump of helicopter rotors. This was where theory would meet reality, where 2 years of intensive training would be tested against an enemy that didn't follow the rules of any simulation. Our unit, Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment, had been in country for 3 months when the mission came down that would change everything. Intelligence had identified a Taliban weapons cache in a remote village nestled in a valley about 20 kilometers from our base. The operation would require a nighttime insertion, careful coordination with local forces, and the kind of precision that left no room for error. I had been assigned as the primary medic for the patrol, a responsibility that weighed on me like a physical presence. Strapped to my body were the tools that could mean the difference between a soldier going home to his family or going home in a flag-draped coffin. In my aid bag were morphine syrettes, pressure bandages, hemostatic agents, and airway management devices that I could operate blindfolded after months of repetitive training. But I also carried something less tangible and more precious: the trust of 12 other soldiers who believed I could keep them alive if the worst happened. Staff Sergeant Davis, our squad leader, was a career soldier from Alabama who had been deployed 4 times and possessed the kind of calm competence that made others feel safer just by proximity. During our final briefing, he looked each of us in the eye, his gaze lingering on me with particular intensity. "Martinez," he said, "this isn't training anymore. If things go sideways out there, these men are going to be counting on you to do what you've been trained to do. I've watched you work for 3 months, and I know you're ready for this. But knowing and doing are different things. You understand me?" I met his gaze without flinching. "Roger, Sergeant, I understand. But understanding and experiencing are indeed different things, as I would learn in the hours that followed." The patrol began smoothly enough. We moved through the darkness using night vision equipment, following predetermined routes that avoided known enemy positions while maintaining communication with our base through encrypted radio systems. The village appeared exactly as described in our intelligence briefings, a cluster of mud brick buildings arranged around a central courtyard, with narrow alleyways that could hide a dozen threats or lead to easy escape routes. The weapons cache was located in a building on the village's eastern edge, identified through weeks of surveillance and confirmed by local informants whose reliability had been carefully vetted. Our mission was straightforward in concept: secure the area, collect evidence, and extract any materials that could be used to harm coalition forces or Afghan civilians. What we couldn't anticipate was that the intelligence was incomplete, that the cache was being guarded by a force much larger than expected, and that our presence had been detected long before we reached our objective. The first indication of trouble came from Specialist Morrison, our point man, who had been moving ahead of the main group to scout for threats. His voice crackled through our radio headsets with the kind of controlled urgency that made everyone freeze in place. Contact front. Multiple targets. Unknown number. They know we're here." The firefight erupted with the sudden intensity of summer lightning. Muzzle flashes strobed in the darkness. Tracer rounds drew glowing lines across our field of vision, and the sharp crack of Alaska 47 fire mixed with the deeper bark of our own weapons. Training took over, muscle memory guiding movements that had been rehearsed hundreds of times, but never under conditions where the consequences were measured in blood rather than scores. I found cover behind a low stone wall and began the mental process that would define the next several hours. Where were our people? Who needed medical attention? What were the most likely casualty scenarios, and how could I position myself to respond effectively? The questions cycled through my mind even as I returned fire, my rifle adding its voice to the symphony of violence that had transformed a quiet Afghan village into a battlefield. The call I had been training for came sooner than expected. Doc Martinez, we need you over here now. A machine gunner from Texas who had joined the Army to pay for college, had taken a round through his upper thigh that was bleeding at a rate that demanded immediate intervention. Moving to his position meant crossing 20 meters of open ground under direct enemy fire, but the alternative was watching a fellow soldier bleed to death while I remained in safety. The sprint to Jenkins felt like running through liquid time, each step deliberate and heavy, the sound of bullets passing close enough to disturb the air around my head. When I reached him, my hands moved automatically through the trauma assessment procedures that had become second nature. Entry wound, exit wound, arterial damage, shock protocol. The injury was serious but manageable if I could control the bleeding and maintain his blood pressure until evacuation was possible. You're gonna be fine, Jenkins, I told him while applying direct pressure to the wound. Clean through and through. Missed the bone, missed the major vessels. You'll be chasing nurses around the hospital in a week. My words were intended to calm him, but they also served another purpose. Speaking the procedures aloud helped me maintain focus under the incredible stress of combat conditions. Every action had to be deliberate, every decision based on medical priorities rather than emotional responses. Jenkins needed fluids, pain management, and rapid evacuation, but he also needed to know that someone was in control of his situation. But Jenkins was just the beginning. As the firefight intensified, more casualties began to accumulate. Private Rodriguez took shrapnel in his shoulder from an improvised explosive device that detonated near his position. Sergeant Thompson, our communications specialist, suffered a concussion when a rocket-propelled grenade exploded against the building he was using for cover. Specialist Williams twisted his ankle severely while moving between positions, an injury that seemed minor until it became clear that he couldn't walk without assistance. Each casualty required a different approach, different priorities, different risk calculations. With Rodriguez, the primary concern was preventing infection in wounds contaminated with debris and foreign material. Thompson needed careful monitoring for signs of traumatic brain injury while maintaining his ability to operate our radio equipment. Williams needed pain management and mobility assistance that wouldn't compromise his ability to defend his position. Managing multiple casualties under combat conditions required a kind of mental compartmentalization I had never fully understood until that moment. Each soldier became a medical problem to be solved, a set of symptoms and treatments that existed independently of personality or friendship. But they also remained human beings, whose lives depended on my ability to make correct decisions under the worst possible circumstances. The breakthrough came when our air support finally arrived. 2 Apache attack helicopters materialized out of the darkness, their 30mm cannons and Hellfire missiles quickly shifting the tactical balance in our favor. The enemy fire that had been pinning us down for over an hour suddenly decreased as our opponents were forced to seek cover or risk annihilation from above. But the arrival of air support also created new challenges. The helicopters needed clear fields of fire, which meant moving our wounded soldiers to positions that wouldn't interfere with their engagement of enemy targets. This required carrying Jenkins, Rodriguez, and Thompson across terrain that was still under sporadic enemy fire, while maintaining the medical interventions that were keeping them stable. The evacuation itself became a masterpiece of improvised logistics. Using materials from our individual first aid kits and equipment salvaged from our surroundings, I constructed stretcher systems that could protect spinal alignment while allowing for rapid movement. More importantly, I had to maintain IV fluid administration and continuous monitoring of vital signs during transport that pushed my multitasking abilities to their absolute limits. Staff Sergeant Davis appeared at my side during the most chaotic phase of the evacuation, his face streaked with dust and cordite residue but his voice calm and focused. "Martinez, how are they doing? Can they travel? We've got a medevac inbound, but we need to get them to the landing zone." I looked at my 3 patients, each representing a different level of medical complexity, but all stable enough for transport if we moved quickly and carefully. "They're good to go, Sergeant. Jenkins needs blood products as soon as possible, Thompson needs a neurology consult, and Rodriguez needs surgical debridement, but they can all travel. Just give me 2 more minutes to secure their IV lines." The helicopter landing zone was a flat area, about 200 meters from our position, far enough from the village to avoid civilian casualties, but close enough that we could transport wounded soldiers without additional vehicles. Moving 3 casualties across that distance while maintaining medical care and security would require precise coordination between medical priorities and tactical necessities. What followed was the most intense 20 minutes of my military career. Leading a team of soldiers carrying stretchers while monitoring vital signs, adjusting IV flow rates, and communicating with the incoming medevac crew demanded a level of focus that left no room for doubt or hesitation. Every decision had immediate consequences. Every action directly affected someone's chances of survival. The medevac helicopter settled onto the landing zone in a cloud of dust and rotor wash that reduced visibility to almost zero. The flight medics who emerged were seasoned professionals who assessed my patients with the quick efficiency of people who had seen every possible variation of combat trauma. But their questions revealed something I hadn't fully realized during the chaos of treatment. Who provided initial care? The senior flight medic asked while reviewing my documentation of treatments administered. "I did," I replied, helping transfer Jenkins onto the aircraft's stretcher system. He looked at me with something approaching surprise. "All 3 of them? While under fire? How long have you been doing this?" "This is my first deployment," I admitted, suddenly aware of how unlikely that must sound given the complexity of the medical situations I had managed. The flight medic paused in his work, his experienced eyes taking in the quality of the medical interventions I had provided. "Doc, I've been doing this for 8 years, and I've seen veteran medics struggle with single casualties under less pressure than you just handled. Whatever training you received, whoever taught you this stuff, they did something right. But it was the reaction of my fellow soldiers that really mattered." As we watched the medevac helicopter disappear into the night, carrying our wounded teammates toward definitive medical care, Corporal Williams approached me with an expression I had never seen before. Respect earned through competence under fire, the kind of recognition that couldn't be manufactured or faked. "Martinez," he said, extending his hand for a shake that carried the weight of brotherhood forged in combat, "I don't know how you stayed so calm out there, but you saved their lives. All 3 of them. That was some serious professional work." The other soldiers nodded their agreement, their faces showing the kind of trust that could only be earned through shared danger and mutual dependence. In the space of a few hours, I had transformed from the unit's medic to someone they knew they could count on when everything went wrong. The quiet girl from Iowa who had been dismissed as playing soldier had become a combat veteran whose skills had been tested under the worst possible conditions. But the real validation came 3 days later, when we received word from the military hospital in Germany where our casualties had been evacuated. Jenkins had undergone successful surgery to repair vascular damage, with full recovery expected. Rodriguez's wounds had been cleaned and closed without complications, and he would return to duty within a month. Thompson's concussion had been properly diagnosed and treated, with no lasting neurological effects anticipated. More importantly, the trauma surgeon who had received them had sent a message through official channels that eventually reached our unit commander. The initial care provided by our medic, he wrote, had been exemplary in every respect. Proper triage, appropriate interventions, excellent documentation, and most critically, decision-making that had prevented minor injuries from becoming life-threatening complications. Colonel Harrison, our battalion commander, called me into his office to discuss the incident and its aftermath. He was a career officer with 3 previous deployments who had seen every variation of combat performance, both exemplary and inadequate. His questions were thorough and professional, designed to understand not just what I had done, but how I had managed to perform so effectively under conditions that had challenged veteran medics. Staff Sergeant Martinez, he said, using the rank I had recently been promoted to based on my performance during our deployment. What you accomplished during that firefight represents the highest standards of military medical care. But more than that, it represents the kind of leadership under pressure that defines exceptional soldiers. Your unit commander tells me that the other soldiers in your squad have complete confidence in your abilities, and frankly, so do I. His words carried weight because they came from someone who understood the difference between training and reality, someone who had seen enough combat to recognize genuine competence when it appeared. But they also carried implications that extended beyond simple recognition. Exceptional performance under fire was noted, documented, and remembered by people whose opinions shaped military careers and determined future assignments. The official commendation that followed was less important than the unofficial recognition I received from soldiers throughout our forward operating base. Word of the triple casualty save had spread through the informal networks that connected combat units, and I found myself being consulted by medics from other platoons who wanted to understand the techniques I had used and the decision-making process that had guided my actions. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Master Sergeant Patricia Coleman, a combat medic with 4 deployments and a reputation as one of the best trauma care specialists in the Army, sought me out during a rare quiet moment between missions. "Martinez," she said, settling onto the plywood bench outside our medical aid station, "I've been doing this job for 12 years, and I've seen a lot of medics come and go. Some are competent, some are dedicated, and a few are genuinely gifted at trauma care under pressure. You're in that last category, and you need to understand what that means." She explained that exceptional combat medics were rare enough that their reputations preceded them, that word of their capabilities spread through military medical networks, and that they were sought out for the most challenging assignments and the most critical missions. More importantly, they became the standard by which other medics were measured, the example that training programs used to illustrate what was possible when skill, dedication, and natural ability combined under the worst possible conditions. "What I'm telling you," she continued, "is that what you did out there didn't just save 3 lives. It established you as someone who can be trusted with the lives of others when everything goes wrong. That's a reputation that will follow you for the rest of your career, and it comes with both opportunities and responsibilities you might not have anticipated." Her words proved prophetic in ways I couldn't have imagined. Within weeks of the firefight, I began receiving assignment opportunities that reflected my demonstrated capabilities under combat conditions. Special missions that required medical support for high-risk operations. Training opportunities with elite units that needed medics capable of independent decision-making under extreme pressure. Recommendations for advanced schools that would expand my skills and increase my value as a combat medical specialist. But perhaps most importantly, I began to understand that the steel my grandfather had recognized in me had been tested and proven in the crucible of combat. The girl who had been dismissed as going through a phase, who had been told she was playing soldier, who had been accused of abandoning her family for misguided adventure, had become a combat veteran whose skills had been validated under conditions that left no room for pretense or self-deception. The letters I wrote home during this period tried to convey some of what I was experiencing, but I quickly realized that the gap between my reality and my family's understanding had grown too wide to bridge with words alone. How could I explain the weight of holding someone's life in your hands while bullets passed overhead? How could I describe the trust of soldiers who knew you would risk everything to bring them home alive? How could I communicate the sense of purpose that came from using your skills to preserve what was most precious in the world? Their responses revealed that the distance between us had become more than geographical. My mother's letters focused on local news and family gossip, as if my experiences could be normalized through exposure to familiar concerns. My father's communications carried an undertone of resigned acceptance, as if he had given up trying to understand my choices, but hoped they would eventually lead back to more conventional paths. Jessica's messages were the most painful, because they revealed a fundamental inability to comprehend that my military service was anything more than an elaborate rebellion against family expectations. But there was another letter that arrived during this period, one that would prove more significant than any family communication. It came through official channels, bearing the return address of the Department of the Army and marked with classifications that indicated its importance. Inside was notification that I had been recommended for the Bronze Star Medal with V device for Valor, based on my actions during the firefight that had saved 3 soldiers' lives. The citation, written in the formal language of military recognition, described my performance during the engagement in terms that seemed to apply to someone else entirely. Staff Sergeant Martinez's exceptional courage under fire, combined with her medical expertise and leadership under pressure, directly resulted in the preservation of 3 soldiers' lives during intense combat operations. Her actions reflect the highest traditions of military service and bring great credit upon herself, her unit, and the United States Army. Reading those words, I realized that the transformation that had begun in basic training was now complete. The uncertain girl who had left Cedar Falls, Iowa, seeking something she couldn't fully articulate, had become a combat veteran whose capabilities had been tested and proven under the most demanding conditions imaginable. The steel my grandfather had seen in me had been forged into something that could bear the weight of life and death responsibility without breaking. But I also understood that this recognition would eventually reach my family, and when it did, it would force a reckoning with assumptions and dismissals that had shaped our relationship for years. The daughter they had accused of playing soldier was about to be honored by her country for actions that had saved lives under enemy fire. The girl they had claimed was running away from responsibility had accepted the ultimate responsibility of holding others' lives in her hands. The medal ceremony was still months away, but I could already envision the moment when my family would be forced to confront the reality of who I had become and what I had accomplished. It would be a moment of vindication, but also a moment of truth that would reveal whether the distance between us could ever be bridged, or whether some chasms were simply too wide to cross. The invitation arrived on official stationery, embossed with the seal of the United States Army and addressed to my parents in Cedar Falls. Jessica called me at Fort Campbell 2 days after it was delivered, her voice carrying a mixture of confusion and something that might have been excitement. "Sarah, there's this formal invitation here from the Army. Something about a medal ceremony? Mom and Dad don't really understand what it means, but it looks important. Are you getting some kind of award?" I had been expecting this call for weeks, ever since my command had confirmed that the Bronze Star ceremony would be held at Fort Campbell rather than overseas. The decision to have family present was both an honor and a complication I hadn't fully prepared for. Explaining the significance of the Bronze Star with Valor device to people who had spent years dismissing my military service as an extended phase would require patience I wasn't sure I possessed. "It's the Bronze Star Medal," I said carefully, choosing my words with the precision I had learned to apply to medical procedures. "It's awarded for heroic or meritorious achievement in combat operations. The ceremony is in 3 weeks." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the connection had been lost. When Jessica finally spoke, her voice carried a note of uncertainty that was completely unlike her usual confident tone. "Heroic? Sarah, what exactly did you do over there? I mean, we knew you were deployed, but you never really talked about anything specific. This invitation makes it sound like you did something really significant." The question revealed the depth of the disconnect that had grown between us during my deployment. In my letters and phone calls home, I had carefully avoided describing the realities of combat operations, partly to protect my family from worry and partly because I had learned that they were more comfortable with vague generalities than specific details about the dangers I faced daily. "I provided medical care to wounded soldiers during a firefight," I said, employing the same understated language that military personnel used when discussing combat actions. 3 members of my unit were injured, and I was able to treat them successfully while under enemy fire. But even this sanitized description seemed to overwhelm Jessica's ability to process what I was telling her. "Enemy fire? Sarah, you were being shot at? And you were treating wounded people while that was happening?" "That's what combat medics do," I replied, realizing that this conversation was forcing me to articulate realities I had never needed to explain before. When soldiers are wounded in combat, someone has to provide medical care regardless of the tactical situation. That's my job. The concept of treating casualties under fire was so far outside Jessica's frame of reference that she struggled to formulate a response. Her world was one of marketing campaigns and engagement parties, where the greatest risks involved missed deadlines or social embarrassments. The idea that her sister had been making life-and-death medical decisions while bullets passed overhead challenged everything she thought she knew about both my capabilities and my chosen profession. "I need to call Mom and Dad," she said finally. "They're going to want to know about this. Sarah, this is huge, isn't it? I mean, they don't give out medals like this to just anyone." Her recognition of the medal's significance marked a fundamental shift in how my family understood my military service. For years, they had treated my deployment as an extended training exercise, a prolonged version of the playing soldier phase they had been waiting for me to outgrow. The Bronze Star forced them to confront the reality that I had been engaged in actual combat operations, where real people died, and real decisions had life-and-death consequences. My parents called that evening, their voices carrying a mixture of pride and bewilderment that was both touching and frustrating. My mother spoke first, her words tumbling over each other in her eagerness to express feelings she was clearly struggling to understand. "Sarah, honey, we got this invitation, and Jessica explained about the medal, but we still don't really understand what happened. The letter says something about heroism and valor, and there are all these military terms we don't recognize. Can you help us understand what this means?" I found myself in the strange position of having to explain my own heroism to people who had known me my entire life but had never seen me as someone capable of heroic action. The girl who had been dismissed as the wrong daughter was being honored by her country for actions that exemplified the highest traditions of military service. But her own family couldn't reconcile this recognition with their memories of the quiet teenager who had left home to join the army. During a mission in Afghanistan, 3 soldiers in my unit were wounded during a firefight with enemy forces, I explained, using the patient tone I had developed for briefing officers who weren't familiar with medical procedures. I provided trauma care to all 3 casualties while our position was under direct fire. The care I provided enabled them to survive until they could be evacuated to a military hospital. My father took the phone, his voice carrying the particular quality it acquired when he was trying to process information that challenged his fundamental assumptions about the world. "Sarah, when you say under fire, do you mean people were actually shooting at you, with real bullets, and you were treating wounded soldiers while that was happening?" "Yes, Dad. That's what combat medics do. When soldiers are wounded, they need immediate medical attention, regardless of the tactical situation. Waiting for the shooting to stop isn't an option when someone is bleeding to death." The concept seemed to overwhelm him as completely as it had Jessica. In their world, medical care was provided in sterile hospitals by people wearing clean scrubs, not in dusty Afghan villages by soldiers wearing body armor and carrying rifles. The idea that I had been performing complex trauma procedures while engaged in active combat operations was so far outside their experience that they struggled to integrate it with their understanding of who I was and what I was capable of accomplishing. But it was my mother's next question that revealed the depth of their transformation and understanding. "Sarah, were you scared? I mean, when people were shooting at you and you had to help those soldiers, were you afraid?" The question was more personal than anything she had asked me since I joined the Army, and it required me to admit to vulnerabilities I had been trained to suppress. "Yes, Mom, I was scared. But being scared doesn't change what needs to be done. Those soldiers were counting on me to keep them alive, and fear isn't an excuse for failing to do your job." The admission seemed to humanize the situation for her in a way that technical descriptions of medical procedures hadn't. She could understand fear, could relate to the experience of being frightened and having to act anyway. More importantly, she was beginning to understand that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act effectively despite being afraid. "We're going to come to the ceremony," she said with a firmness that surprised me. "We don't understand everything about what you did, but we understand that it was important, and that you saved people's lives. We should be there." The decision to attend the ceremony represented a significant shift in my family's relationship with my military service. For years, they had treated my career as something that happened to me rather than something I had chosen and excelled at. Their presence at the Bronze Star ceremony would represent the first time they had voluntarily participated in my military life, rather than merely tolerating it from a distance. But their attendance also created complications I hadn't anticipated. The ceremony would be held at Fort Campbell, surrounded by soldiers who knew me as Staff Sergeant Martinez, combat veteran and proven leader under fire. My family would be entering my world for the first time, and the contrast between their civilian perspectives and military realities would be stark and potentially uncomfortable. More importantly, Jessica had decided to bring her fiancé Michael to the ceremony. Captain Thompson was a logistics officer who had never deployed to combat zones, but he was familiar enough with military culture to understand the significance of what was happening. His presence would add another layer of complexity to an event that was already emotionally fraught. The weeks leading up to the ceremony were filled with preparations that went beyond the military logistics of organizing a formal awards presentation. I found myself trying to prepare my family for an experience that would be completely foreign to them, while simultaneously trying to maintain the professional composure expected of a soldier being honored for heroic action. Colonel Harrison, who would be presenting the medal, called me into his office to discuss the ceremony and its implications for my future career. He was a thoughtful leader who understood that military recognition carried responsibilities as well as honors, and he wanted to ensure I was prepared for both. Staff Sergeant Martinez, he began, using the formal address that indicated the serious nature of our conversation. This Bronze Star represents more than recognition for your actions during that firefight. It establishes you as a combat leader whose capabilities have been tested and proven under the most demanding conditions. That reputation will follow you throughout your career and will influence the assignments and opportunities you receive. His words echoed what Master Sergeant Coleman had told me months earlier, but they carried additional weight coming from a battalion commander whose opinion would influence promotion boards and selection processes for years to come. Excellence in combat was noted, documented, and remembered by people whose decisions shaped military careers. More immediately, he continued, this ceremony will be attended by senior officers from throughout the division, including some who are involved in selecting personnel for advanced schools and specialized assignments. Your performance during the ceremony itself will be observed and evaluated, so maintain the same professionalism that earned you this recognition in the first place. The reminder that the ceremony was itself a form of evaluation added another dimension to my preparation. I would be representing not only myself, but also my unit, my training, and the standards of professional excellence that defined military medical personnel. The presence of my family would make this balancing act even more challenging. But the most significant complication emerged 3 days before the ceremony, when Jessica called with news that would transform the event from a family celebration into something much more complex and potentially explosive. Sarah, I have to tell you something about Michael that you probably don't know, she said, her voice carrying an uncharacteristic note of nervousness. He's been asking a lot of questions about your deployment and the medal you're getting. Apparently, some of the other officers at his base have been talking about what you did, and he's been hearing stories. The military's informal communication networks were notoriously efficient at spreading information about significant events, and I wasn't surprised that word of the Bronze Star had reached officers at other installations. What concerned me was Jessica's tone, which suggested that Michael's interest was more than casual curiosity about his future sister-in-law's military service. What kind of stories? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. He heard that you saved the lives of soldiers from his unit, not his current unit, but soldiers he served with during his previous assignment. Sarah, one of the men you treated in Afghanistan, apparently served under Michael's command at Fort Bragg before he deployed with your unit. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. The interconnected nature of military assignments meant that personnel moved between units regularly, creating networks of shared experience and mutual obligation that extended far beyond individual deployments. If Michael had previously commanded one of the soldiers I had treated, the ceremony would represent more than family recognition of my military service. It would represent a direct confrontation with the life and death reality of what I had accomplished. Which soldier? I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. Corporal Jenkins. Michael was his company commander at Fort Bragg before Jenkins deployed with your unit to Afghanistan. He says Jenkins was one of his best soldiers, and that losing him would have been devastating for the entire company. Sarah, Michael knows that you saved Jenkins' life. The information reframed everything about the upcoming ceremony. Michael wouldn't be attending as Jessica's fiancé, who was politely supporting his future sister-in-law's military career. He would be attending as an officer who understood exactly what I had done and why it mattered. Someone who could speak with authority about the value of the life I had preserved and the skills I had demonstrated under fire. More importantly, his presence would provide a bridge between my family's civilian perspective and the military reality of what the Bronze Star represented. They might not understand the technical aspects of combat trauma care or the significance of providing medical support under enemy fire, but they would be able to understand Michael's reaction to learning that I had saved the life of someone he had commanded and cared about. "Jessica," I said carefully, "has Michael told you how he feels about what happened?" There was a long pause before she answered, and when she spoke, her voice carried a note of something I had never heard before when she talked about my military service. It might have been respect. "He cried," she said quietly. "When he found out that you were the medic who saved Jenkins, he actually cried. He said that Jenkins has a wife and 2 little kids, and that losing him would have destroyed his family. He said that what you did wasn't just heroic, it was essential, and that he owed you a debt he could never repay." The image of Michael Thompson, the polished officer Jessica had been planning to marry, crying over the life of a soldier I had treated, was almost impossible to reconcile with the dismissive attitudes my family had displayed toward my military service. But it also represented the kind of validation I had never expected to receive from anyone connected to my previous life. "He wants to meet you before the ceremony," Jessica continued. "Not as my fiancé meeting my sister, but as an officer meeting the medic who saved one of his soldiers. Sarah, I think he understands what you do in a way that none of us ever have." The prospect of meeting Michael under these circumstances was both gratifying and terrifying. For years, I had been the daughter and sister who had chosen a path her family couldn't understand or appreciate. Now I would be meeting Jessica's fiancé as a combat veteran whose actions had directly impacted his life and career, someone whose capabilities he understood better than anyone in my family ever had. But I also realized that this meeting would represent a moment of truth for Jessica herself. She would be forced to confront the reality that the sister she had dismissed as playing soldier had performed actions that moved a career military officer to tears. The girl she had accused of being selfish and irresponsible had saved the life of a father and husband, preserving a family that would otherwise have been destroyed by war. The ceremony was still days away, but I could already sense that it would represent more than military recognition for combat heroism. It would be a reckoning with years of misunderstanding and dismissal, a moment when the true nature of my military service would be revealed to people who had never bothered to look beyond their own assumptions and prejudices. The Bronze Star might recognize my actions in Afghanistan, but the ceremony would reveal whether the distance that had grown between my family and me could ever be bridged, or whether some transformations were simply too profound to be understood by people who had never tested themselves against meaningful challenges. I spent the remaining days before the ceremony preparing not just for military honors, but for a confrontation with the past that would determine the future of every relationship that mattered to me. The girl who had left Cedar Falls searching for something she couldn't articulate was about to discover whether the woman she had become could coexist with the family that had shaped her, or whether some journeys led to destinations from which there was no return. The morning of the ceremony dawned crisp and clear at Fort Campbell, with autumn sunlight streaming through the windows of the community center, where the awards presentation would take place. I stood before the mirror in my quarters, adjusting the dress blue uniform that had been pressed to perfection for this moment. The Bronze Star, with its distinctive red, white, and blue ribbon, would soon join the other decorations on my chest, but more importantly, this day would mark the culmination of a journey that had transformed both me and my understanding of what family could mean. My parents arrived at the guest quarters 2 hours before the ceremony, looking simultaneously proud and overwhelmed by their first experience on a military installation. My father wore the same suit he had worn to Jessica's college graduation, while my mother had chosen a navy dress that she clearly hoped would be appropriate for such a formal military occasion. Their discomfort was palpable but touching, evidence of their genuine effort to participate in a world they had never attempted to understand. Jessica and Michael arrived shortly after, and the moment I saw Captain Thompson in his dress uniform, I understood that this encounter would be unlike any family interaction I had ever experienced. He stood with the bearing of a professional soldier, but his eyes carried an intensity that spoke to personal investment rather than mere courtesy. When Jessica introduced us, his handshake lingered longer than protocol required, and his voice carried a weight that immediately commanded attention. "Staff Sergeant Martinez," he said, using my rank with the precision that indicated genuine respect rather than formal politeness. "I need to speak with you privately before the ceremony begins. There are things I need to say that can't wait for a more convenient time." We stepped outside onto a small patio behind the guest quarters, where the sounds of base activity provided a familiar backdrop to what I sensed would be a conversation that would reshape my relationship with my family forever. Michael's demeanor shifted subtly once we were alone, his official bearing giving way to something more personal and urgent. "Corporal Jenkins was more than just another soldier in my company," he began, his voice steady but carrying undertones of deep emotion. "He was the kind of NCO who made everyone around him better, the guy other soldiers looked up to when things got difficult. When I heard he had been wounded in Afghanistan, I spent weeks checking casualty reports and hospital updates, terrified that I would see his name on the wrong kind of list." He paused, gathering himself before continuing with words that I could see were difficult for him to speak. "When I learned that you were the medic who treated him, who kept him alive under fire until he could be evacuated, I realized that I owed you something I could never adequately repay. Jenkins has 2 daughters, ages 4 and 6. Because of your actions under enemy fire, they still have a father. Because of your skill and courage, his wife didn't become a widow. Because of who you are and what you're capable of, an entire family remained intact." The weight of his words settled over me like a physical presence. I had known intellectually that successful trauma care preserved families and prevented tragedies, but hearing the specific human impact of my actions from someone who knew Jenkins personally made the abstract reality suddenly concrete and overwhelming. "Captain Thompson," I began, but he held up a hand to indicate he wasn't finished. "What I'm trying to tell you is that your family has no idea who you really are," he continued, his voice gaining strength and conviction. "They see the daughter and sister who chose a path they didn't understand, but they don't see the combat veteran whose decisions under fire saved lives. They know you received a medal, but they don't understand that you earned it by performing medical miracles while people were trying to kill you." His words articulated something I had been feeling but hadn't been able to express: the disconnect between my family's perception of my military service and the reality of what that service had entailed. They had attended the ceremony out of familial obligation and growing curiosity, but they still fundamentally misunderstood what I had become and what I had accomplished. "Today is going to change that," Michael said with the certainty of someone who understood military culture and its capacity to reveal character under pressure. "When Colonel Harrison reads the citation for your Bronze Star, when the details of what you did become public record, your family is going to understand for the first time exactly who Sarah Martinez really is." We returned to the community center, where military personnel were making final preparations for the ceremony. The room had been arranged with precision that reflected the importance of the occasion, with chairs aligned in perfect rows, and a small stage decorated with regimental colors, and the flag that represented everything we had sworn to defend. Senior officers from throughout the division were beginning to arrive, their presence indicating the significance attached to recognizing combat heroism. My family took their seats in the front row, their faces showing a mixture of pride and nervousness that would have been touching under different circumstances. But I was focused on the ceremony itself, and the professional obligations that came with being honored for actions that reflected on my unit, my training, and the standards of the Army Medical Corps. Colonel Harrison took the stage precisely at the appointed time, his presence commanding immediate attention and respectful silence. He began with remarks about the nature of military service and the particular challenges faced by medical personnel in combat zones, setting a context that would help civilian attendees understand what they were about to witness. "Today we recognize extraordinary heroism performed under the most demanding conditions imaginable," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded troops in multiple combat deployments. "The actions we honor today represent the highest traditions of military medical care and demonstrate the courage, skill, and dedication that define the finest soldiers in our Army." When he called me forward to stand at attention before the assembled audience, I felt the weight of every hour of training, every moment of doubt, and every decision that had led to this point. The girl who had been dismissed as going through a phase was about to be honored by her country for actions that had preserved life under conditions that tested the limits of human capability and professional competence. Colonel Harrison began reading the citation. his voice giving weight and gravity to words that transformed my memories of that chaotic night in Afghanistan into an official record of heroism and professional excellence. For heroic achievement in connection with combat operations against an armed enemy, Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez distinguished herself by exceptionally valorous actions while serving as combat medic during a firefight with enemy forces in eastern Afghanistan. When multiple members of her unit sustained serious injuries during intense enemy contact, Staff Sergeant Martinez moved repeatedly through areas under direct fire to provide life-saving medical treatment to 3 critically wounded soldiers. I could hear my mother's sharp intake of breath as the reality of what I had done began to penetrate her understanding. The sanitized descriptions I had provided during phone calls home were being replaced by official language that made clear the lethal nature of the environment in which I had been operating. Despite continuous enemy fire and extreme personal risk, Staff Sergeant Martinez maintained calm professionalism while providing advanced trauma care that directly prevented the loss of life. Her expert medical interventions, performed under the most hazardous conditions, enabled the successful evacuation of all casualties and their eventual full recovery. My father's hand reached for my mother's, as Colonel Harrison continued with details that painted a picture of sustained heroism under fire, rather than a single moment of courage. The citation described my movement between casualty collection points, the complexity of the medical procedures I had performed, and the leadership I had provided during the evacuation process. Staff Sergeant Martinez's extraordinary heroism, medical expertise, and unwavering commitment to her fellow soldiers reflect the finest traditions of military service and bring great credit upon herself, her unit, and the United States Army. As Colonel Harrison pinned the Bronze Star to my uniform, I caught sight of my family's faces and saw something I had never seen before. My mother was crying openly, but they were tears of pride rather than worry. My father sat straighter in his chair, his expression showing a respect I had never thought possible. Jessica stared at me as if seeing a complete stranger, her usual confident demeanor replaced by something approaching awe. But it was Michael's reaction that provided the bridge between my military reality and my family's understanding. As the ceremony concluded and people began to move toward the reception, he approached my parents with the directness of someone who had something important to communicate. "Mr. and Mrs. Martinez," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his rank and the conviction of personal experience. "I need you to understand something about your daughter that you may not fully appreciate. What Sarah did in Afghanistan wasn't just heroic, it was essential. The soldier she saved, Corporal Jenkins, served under my command before his deployment. He's a father, a husband, and one of the finest NCOs I've ever known. Without Sarah's actions under fire, his family would have been destroyed." My mother looked between Michael and me, her eyes reflecting a dawning comprehension of realities she had never considered. "You knew one of the soldiers Sarah helped?" "More than knew him," Michael replied. "I trained him, led him, and sent him to Afghanistan trusting that soldiers like your daughter would bring him home alive. Sarah didn't just save a soldier's life that night. She preserved a family, honored a trust, and demonstrated the kind of character that defines the very best of our military." Jessica had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the dismissive superiority I had grown accustomed to hearing. "Sarah," she said, approaching me with an expression I had never seen before, "I owe you an apology that I don't know how to give. All these years, I thought you were running away from real life, avoiding real responsibilities. I had no idea you were carrying responsibilities that I can't even imagine." Her words represented more than simple recognition of my military accomplishments. They represented acknowledgement that the path I had chosen was not only valid but essential, that the skills I had developed and the service I had provided mattered in ways that civilian achievements could never match. My father stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion as he struggled to articulate feelings he was clearly experiencing for the first time. "Sarah, I don't understand everything about what you do, but I understand that you save lives. I understand that other parents get to see their children come home because of who you are and what you're capable of. I'm sorry it took me so long to see that. But it was my mother's response that affected me most deeply. She approached me with tears streaming down her face, her hands reaching to touch the Bronze Star as if it were something sacred. 'My daughter,' she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of recognition that had been too long delayed. "My daughter, the hero. I'm so sorry we couldn't see what you were becoming. I'm so sorry we made you feel like you had to prove yourself to us." The reception that followed provided an opportunity for my family to interact with my fellow soldiers and begin to understand the community I had found in military service. They met soldiers who had served with me, who spoke with genuine respect about my capabilities and character. They heard stories about my leadership under pressure, my dedication to the soldiers under my care, and the reputation I had earned among people whose opinions were based on shared danger and mutual dependence. Master Sergeant Coleman approached my parents during the reception, her presence commanding the kind of respect that comes from proven competence and decorated service. "Mr. and Mrs. Martinez," she said, "I want you to know that your daughter is considered one of the finest combat medics in the Army. What she did in Afghanistan wasn't luck or accident. It was the result of exceptional training, natural ability, and the kind of character that can't be taught. You should be incredibly proud of what she's accomplished." As the afternoon progressed, I watched my family's understanding continue to evolve. They began to see me not as the daughter who had chosen wrongly, but as the soldier who had chosen courageously. They started to appreciate that the military hadn't taken me away from real life, but had given me the opportunity to engage with life at its most meaningful level. But perhaps the most significant moment came when Jessica pulled me aside as the reception was winding down, her expression serious and thoughtful. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Do you forgive us? For not understanding, for not supporting you, for making you feel like you had to choose between your family and your calling?" The question forced me to confront feelings I had been carrying for years, the pain of being misunderstood by the people whose approval I had once craved more than anything else. But I also realized that forgiveness wasn't something they could earn through recognition or apologies. It was something I could choose to give because I no longer needed their validation to know my own worth. "Jessica," I said, choosing my words carefully, "I don't need you to understand everything about my choices or my service, but I do need you to respect that this is who I am, not who I'm pretending to be. This isn't a phase or a rebellion or a way of avoiding real responsibilities. This is my life, my calling, and my contribution to something larger than myself." She nodded, her eyes reflecting a maturity I had never seen before. "I think I'm beginning to understand that. And I think I'm beginning to understand how wrong I was about what constitutes a real life." As we prepared to leave Fort Campbell, my father approached me with something in his hands. It was a small wooden box, worn smooth by years of handling. "This was your grandfather's," he said, his voice carrying a weight of recognition that had been building throughout the day. "He wanted you to have it, but I never understood why until today. He saw something in you that I was too blind to recognize." Inside the box was my grandfather's combat medical badge from Vietnam, along with a letter written in his careful handwriting. The letter was brief but profound, expressing his pride in my choice to serve and his confidence that I would honor the family name through military service rather than conventional civilian achievements. "He knew," my mother said softly, reading over my shoulder. "Somehow he knew exactly who you were meant to become." The drive back to Cedar Falls was different from any family trip we had ever taken. Instead of the usual uncomfortable silences or forced conversations about topics that revealed our fundamental differences, we talked about my service, my soldiers, and my plans for the future. For the first time, my family was curious about my military career, not as something to be tolerated, but as something to be understood and respected. The Bronze Star ceremony had accomplished something I had never thought possible. It had bridged the gap between who I was and who my family thought I should be, revealing that their limited understanding had been the problem, rather than my choices. The girl they had dismissed as playing soldier had become a woman whose skills and courage had been tested under the most demanding conditions imaginable. But more importantly, I had learned that validation from others, even family, was less essential than I had once believed. The strength my grandfather had recognized in me hadn't required their approval to develop and flourish. It had simply required the opportunity to be tested and proven under conditions that revealed character rather than creating it. As we reached Cedar Falls and I prepared to return to Fort Campbell and my continuing military career, I realized that the homecoming I had always wanted had finally occurred. Not because my family had changed their fundamental nature, but because I had finally become secure enough in my own identity to accept their love without requiring their complete understanding. The Bronze Star would take its place among my other decorations, but the real victory was more personal and more lasting. I had proven to myself and to anyone who cared to notice that the quiet girl from Iowa carried within her the strength to face any challenge, save any life, and honor any trust placed in her care. The steel my grandfather had seen in me had been tested and proven in the fires of combat, but it had also been revealed in the quieter courage required to remain true to my calling, despite the cost in family relationships and conventional approval. Sometimes the greatest victories are measured not in medals received, but in the integrity maintained while earning them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.